Let's talk about Antony Blinken's trip to the Middle East. One of the first things that we have is the U.S. says it is moving forward with its plans to reopen its Palestinian mission in Jerusalem. So, when the Trump administration decided to move its Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which really upset the Palestinians because it was an indication that the U.S. was recognizing Israel as the sole controlling power of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be like a shared capital city in the two-state solution. And in a lot of ways, it just goes to show that the Americans aren't interested in any way in the two-state solution. It's just a way at this point to drag the Palestinians along and pretend that we're giving them real offers when we're not. And so when the Trump administration moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it also either, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, closed or consolidated. Depending on how you look at how the Trump administration will put it, that the building or the office it used to traditionally have diplomacy and engage with the Palestinians was just folded into or completely closed the Israeli embassy that was now in Jerusalem. The Biden administration took over, and rather than going back and moving the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv and resetting the kind of U.S.-Israeli policy to where it was under the Biden administration, went ahead and endorsed the Trump move, but I think 6 months down the road, started to float the idea of reopening the Palestinian mission, and I guess this that maybe they see as something of a little nod towards the Palestinians. The Israelis have opposed this pretty forcefully. The government, Naftali Bennett, has been saying that no way are you going to do this. But Antony Blinken said that the U.S. was going to go ahead with it. Now, it's worth noting that the State Department did not give a date on when this new mission will be opened, and so it could be one of those government projects that's just perpetually under construction. At the same time, it is something that could be happening. One of the interesting things is, this is something that I think probably doesn't mean a whole lot to the average Palestinians. Maybe it means something a little bit to the Palestinian leadership, but at this point, there hasn't been, elections in Palestine since I think 2006, when I wasn't even old enough, wouldn't have been old enough to vote. And so most, I think Palestinians at this point, especially those in Gaza, certainly wouldn't have been old enough to vote in the last election there. And so the politicians that represent the Palestinians actually probably aren't very representative of them, even, by standards that we see in the United States. Now, let's move on real quick and talk about another Blinken statement, and this one on the Abraham Accords. And these were, of course, rolled out, I think, in 2020, towards the end of the Trump administration. And they were, I think, a set of 4 normalization agreements between different Arab states or Muslim majority states and Israel. So this was the UAE was one of the first, but this wasn't really, what you would typically think or consider a diplomatic agreement. The U.S. had agreed to sell the Emirates, and the Biden administration has moved through with this $23 billion worth of advanced weaponry, including F-35s and armed drones. And so this is pretty concerning that the U.S. is moving forward with this, giving Israel this or the Emirates that much more military technology, which essentially just kicked off an arms race with Israel, because they say the U.S. has a policy that says Israel has to have significantly advanced weaponry compared to the other Gulf Arab states, and so the U.S. needs to sell Israel more upgraded weaponry because of the deal with the UAE. The U.S. also cut a deal with Sudan, and with Sudan, it required that government to pay, I think, $300 million to U.S. families who were victims of one of Osama bin Laden's attacks, even though the Sudanese a couple of years before, or a year before actually, had overthrown the longtime dictator of Sudan who was in charge when bin Laden was there. And then Sudan, with that payment plus normalizing ties with Israel, was taking off the state sponsor of terror list. The U.S. also normalized relations with the U.S. also facilitated Israel normalizing relations with Mozambique, or not Mozambique, excuse me, with Morocco. And with Morocco, the deal was that the U.S. would essentially give a rubber stamp and announce, change their policy from opposing to supporting the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, which I'm not going to get into a whole lot right now, but is essentially a human rights nightmare there in West Africa. And so, this was what the U.S. called diplomacy. And rather than, scoffing at it as you would think Biden's Secretary of State would, the U.S. has rather looked to build on this. Now, one of the things that the Palestinians at least felt was a result of the Abraham Accords was they were cut out of agreements from Arab states or Muslim states that said they would not normalize relations with Israel until Israel stopped treating the Palestinians like garbage. And what has happened is that these states have normalized relations with Israel before, and while Israel was actually treating Palestinians continually worse and worse and worse. And so, Palestine didn't like the Abraham Accords. And here you have Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, inexplicably saying that he thinks building on the Abraham Accords can help diplomacy between Israel and Palestine. And so there's two possibilities here. One is that our Secretary of State is incompetent, and I think this is probably the more likely one, that he really just thinks that, this was Jewish Muslim diplomacy, and therefore it must be good towards normalizing relations between Israel and Palestine, even though the Palestinians were opposed to this. Or this is sadistic, and what the U.S. is trying to do, and what even under the Biden administration now, and I think this was the Trump plan, was to cut off Palestine from more and more of its Arab allies, further and further isolating, the people that are subject to Israel's apartheid policies and live in a state where they don't have rights because of the, where their ancestry is, right? That by cutting off all the Palestinians' Arab allies and everything, that will essentially put them in a weaker and weaker diplomatic position and force them to eventually just accept whatever garbage deal that Israel and the United States ends up offering up. And I'm not quite sure which of the two things it is in there. It kind of seems like it might be the second one too, because Blinken said this could be used as leverage, although it's not exactly clear how this would be used as leverage against Israel, since the U.S. in all these agreements has essentially bent over backwards to make these countries do the deals with Israel. Now, let's see, what else do we have on Blinken's trip? So Blinken's trip to the Middle East, he was going to go meet with the Israeli foreign minister Yair Lapid, and then he was going to go and meet with the Emirati foreign minister, and then he was going to meet with the two together, and that was going to be somewhat of a significant event because Israel, I don't think, has had that high level of a meeting with a U.S. official and then an official of another Gulf Arab state. And so these meetings were happening, and one of the main things to come out of the first meeting, again, the U.S.-Israel meeting, is that Blinken and was very hawkish towards Iran. He said, time is running out and we are prepared to turn to other options if Iran doesn't change course. And these consultations with our allies and partners are a part of that. And then the Israeli Foreign Minister Lapid made clear that Blinken's other options are a threat, saying, I would like to start by repeating what the Secretary of State just said. Yes, other options are going to be on the table if diplomacy fails. And by saying other options, I think everybody understands here in Israel, in the Emirates, and in Tehran what it is that we mean. And this is, very, very clearly a threat here. So we also have a statement, and Dave DeCamp highlights this in his article, from Robert Malley, saying that the U.S. is preparing for other options. Of course, this is disappointing. One of the few signals that we had from the Biden administration, and that was interested in genuine diplomacy with Iran, was the appointment of Robert Malley as the special envoy for Iran, because he had been a part of the Obama team that successfully negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA. Back in the Obama administration. And so bringing him back in suggested that maybe they were looking to repeat that level of diplomacy. However, he hasn't been very optimistic about the entire time, and seems to be just as willing to go along with this very aggressive and hawkish strategy that Biden is moving forward with, being completely unwilling to offer the Iranians anything to bring them back into talks. Along with what was happening between the foreign ministers, we had a statement from Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and he said that continued the threats against Iran by saying that there were non-peaceful ways to deal with Iran. I'm guessing that so there's this really backwards thing that happens in like international affairs, where sanctions are referred to as like peaceful options because you're not actively bombing people. Starving people to death, by the view of the members of the world empire, is an act of peaceful negotiation, where if you were let's say, bombing somebody, then that would not be peaceful. And so I think that's what Israel's prime minister is saying there. To back up his statements, or to, say that present a need to act out non-peacefully against Iran, he says Iran is blatantly violating the IAEA commitments. And this is one of the most hypocritical statements you could possibly imagine a politician saying. I mean, this is a whopper by any standards, as Israel is a country outside of the non-proliferation treaty that has nuclear weapons, a completely unregulated nuclear weapon state. And so to condemn another country for having any kind of unregulated nuclear program is a complete joke and a farce, and he should be laughed out of the room for it. And then the other issue is, of course, is that one of the places Iran is, said to not be complying with the IAEA is at the surveillance as Kraja facility, where Israel carried out an attack on the facility and damaged the IAEA cameras that Iran later took down. And so it's very interesting that Israel is blaming Iran for not living up to the IAEA protocols, when they're one of the states that is actively making sure Iran isn't meeting them, because they're blowing up the IAEA cameras. This is absolutely insane. We also had the Israeli foreign minister claim that Iran is becoming a nuclear threshold state. This is an interesting term. There may be a little bit of kind of truth to it. Scott Horn talks about how Iran is either has, or is probably on the verge of having a Japanese style latent nuclear deterrent, which means that if some country went to war with Iran, or was, Iran really felt like they needed to, for whatever reason, decide to build a nuclear weapon, they would be able to do so with the technology, that they have, the nuclear energy technology that they have, the nuclear reactors that they have, what they know, how they know to refine the nuclear waste and to spin it in centrifuge it and make it a high enough level to make a nuclear bomb. Maybe my guess would be that Iran is probably significantly and meaningfully further from that than the Japanese, but at the same time, within like a year or so, like if Iran really just dedicated itself, if the US started to wage an open war on Iran, then maybe Iran could develop a nuclear weapon in that time. But the Israelis are trying to make it out like Iran at any time could develop their nuclear weapon, and that is something they're trying to do, which is very clearly not the case. And so it's just a very interesting way that this is being phrased, especially because at this point, Iran has only enriched uranium up to 60%, where you would need at least 90% for it to be weapons grade. So Blinken had a warning to Israel during their meeting. This didn't have anything to do with like, hey, we're really trying to get back within the Iran nuclear deal, so can you please not, carry out any attacks against the Iranians, threaten the Iranians anytime soon. But rather what Blinken warned Israel about was too much cooperation with China. This is echoing the statement that William Burns, the CIA director, raised when he was in Israel in August, and so this really isn't a surprise at all, but that it came up from the State Department as well. I think is really trying to tell Israel, like, hey, we really don't care so much about the Palestinians. We're like, kind of concerned about reopening diplomatic mission, not so much concerned about what you do in Syria or the warfare against Iran or the threats against Iran, the preventing the U.S. from engaging in diplomacy with Iran. But any kind of investment that China has in Israel is completely unacceptable to us. And this is just the absolute insanity of current U.S. foreign policy. I'm not surprised at this by all. China's the big bad, and so we're willing to, make all these other concessions, even as we go around the world saying, we're the promoters of democracy, and Israel, we're the promoters of apartheid and authoritarianism, and we're willing to support that and have no problem supporting that as long as we could put some pressure on Israel not to get too close with China. Israel also carried out some airstrikes in Syria. These hit the Palmyra region, which is somewhat significant as Russia has a series of bases in that region. The Reuters article I have here frames this all as, oh, it's Iran, and this is just Israel and Iranian proxy war. Not, this is Israel carrying out a war against Assad's Shia forces in Syria that if they weren't fighting against Israel or weren't concerned about Israeli airstrikes, they would be probably carrying out operations against ISIS. And so this is, in a roundabout way, strikes that are beneficial to the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda safe haven, the Al-Nusra safe haven in the north of the country in the Idlib province. And so, these strikes the U.S. shouldn't support for that reason. All the better if Assad consolidates power over Syria at this point, finishes mopping up the jihadist threats in his country. And while he is by, no means a great guy, there's not going to be democratic rule in Syria. Allow the Syrian people to work out their problems with their leaders, because when the U.S. gets involved, we create the Islamic State. But that is what Israel is encouraging with these airstrikes. Now, I made the point on the last show, actually, that at some point, Syria cannot just allow the U.S., Turkey, and jihadists to control large portions of this territory, especially the U.S., where that territory is very lucrative. And then it can't allow Israel forever to carry out airstrikes against Syrian targets and just, bomb near downtown Damascus, bomb near Palmyra. And in response to this strike, the Shia militia said that they would be looking to exact revenge against Israel. Not sure how it's going to happen. It could be simple as shelling into the Golan Heights or something like that, or it could be far more covert and timed for later. We see 2 or 3 months from now, some kind of missile be launched into Israel, or some kind of Israeli assets in the region be targeted in some way by these Shia militias. So definitely worth keeping an eye on. But it's worth knowing that not just this strike near Palmyra, which is an escalation. Usually they bomb around Damascus and try to hit these facilities where it's Iranian, where they're backing Assad, where they're helping to like train, fund, arm militias and stuff like that. They're hitting those facilities. They're hitting Assad's facilities. Here they're hitting targets that are near Russian facilities. And so I think for that reason it's a little bit of an escalation, but it's also worth noting that this actually came from Jordanian airspace, where Israel typically carries out these airstrikes from Lebanese airspace, and maybe it has something to do with Syria increasing air defenses in different regions of the country. It's unclear as to why, but Israel has also carried out drone strikes near the Deir al-Zor region of Syria. This is closer to the Syrian Iraqi border, near where the U.S. is occupying Syria along the Euphrates River Valley, that Israel is carrying out these strikes. And I think there is a specific reason for this, and we see it in the Reuters article, where everything is portrayed as Israel versus Iran. And so even if there isn't anything here that in any way suggests that even if these militias are Iranian backed, they're not doing anything to Israel. They're just in Syria, mainly acting as Assad's forces as he looks to consolidate control over his own country. Not even the disputed Golan Heights, but, to finally wipe out the terrorists that have for an entire decade now plagued Syria. That's what these forces' main objective is. And Israel continues to carry out these airstrikes, is, no doubt in part to provoke and the very least in the U.S. media, inflate the narrative of Israel versus Iran to make it absolutely impossible, and to put more political pressure on Biden not to return to the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. One of the more sadistic things we have, the Secretary of State, and this is the last story about his press, about his little tour to the Middle East, saying that the U.S. opposes the reconstruction of Syria. This is one of those things that makes me actually sick, and I even hate talking about it, really, because it is just so outrageous and disgusting that after a 10-year long civil war, even if you don't like Assad, he now controls Damascus. He's not going anywhere. The revolution with the U.S.-backed jihadists failed, and it's time to admit that with the millions of people that are in Syria, they need to rebuild their country. Essential infrastructure, being able to get water and fuel and electricity, repair the roads and bridges, all this needs to be done in Syria. And the U.S. is specifically preventing it with its Caesar Act sanctions that target the energy and construction centers. The U.S. is making sure that Syria can't be rebuilt, punishing every Syrian citizen, starving some to death, making sure that the young Syrian children don't have access to the medical care they need to survive. And the U.S. is willing to do this because we don't like the leader Bashar al-Assad, and we say he's bad to his own people. Well, we're bad to all the Syrian people. And it's just unbelievable that the Secretary of State will say something like this and isn't met with a ton of outrage.